In episode 35, we took a look at the economic reasons that a country might have for establishing trade restrictions, all of which revolved around protecting the economic interests of domestic producers. A completely separate category of trade restrictions are those that are not economically, but rather politically motivated. Such restrictions are referred to as economic sanctions. Economic sanctions differ from protectionist policies in that they're not intended to protect the economic interests of the domestic producer, but rather they use economic penalties in an effort to punish a target country. Economic sanctions are used when there are political, moral, or ideological differences between countries. The end goal of the sanctions is to make the target country change its behavior. This could be anything from releasing a political prisoner to halting human rights abuses to giving up nuclear weapons development or even changing an entire political regime. Sanctions can take many forms, but typically they involve a boycott of the target country or an asset freeze. If your country refuses to do business directly with the target, then you're practicing a primary boycott. This could mean refusing to buy products from the target, like refusing to buy oil from Iraq, and or refusing to sell products to the target, like refusing to sell weapons to Afghanistan. There are also secondary boycotts, where your country not only refuses to do business with the target, but also refuses to do business with any other country that continues to do business with the target. If you can cut off the country from its friends, the punishment from the sanctions is more likely to get the desired result. A sanction doesn't have to involve trades of goods and services. In fact, another type of sanction is to freeze the financial assets of the target. This can be very effective, particularly if the sanctioner is a country with a high degree of financial services, which attracts a lot of international assets. Economic sanctions have met with varying degrees of success over the years in terms of achieving the end goal of changing the target's behavior. Take a look at one of the United States' longest-standing and most public examples, U.S. sanctions on Cuba. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro rose to power in Cuba. The U.S. initially took action by refusing to sell arms to Cuba, then by refusing to sell any exports to Cuba, and then refusing to purchase any goods from Cuba. What was the end goal? Democratization, that is, overthrowing Cuba's communist government. How effective were the sanctions? Well, after 50 years, Fidel was still in power, and by the time he died in November 2016, he had groomed his brother Raul to take the helm. You'd think that if any country could scare a target straight by way of economic sanctions, it would be the world's largest economy, the United States. But after 50 years of sanctions, the stated goal had not been achieved. Why do you suppose that is? Research has been conducted over the year to determine what factors make sanctions more or less successful. As with much of economics, the results have been fairly common sense. Sanctions are more likely to succeed when, well, one, the goal of the sanctions is small. For example, obtaining the release of a political prisoner is much easier to achieve than, say, bringing down Cuba's government. 2. Other countries also impose sanctions on the target. There's a difference between unilateral sanctions, where only one country attempts to punish the target, and multilateral sanctions, where many countries agree to punish the target. In the case of Cuba, when the U.S. cut off trade, the USSR stepped in and for decades picked up the slack. And it hasn't only been communist countries that have helped Cuba survive. Canada and Europe have been involved in tourism and telecommunication industries in Cuba. With other trade avenues available to Cuba, the sanctions imposed by the United States have less of an impact. There are other factors that affect the likeliness of sanctions to succeed or not succeed. Perhaps you've heard the saying, "This will hurt me more than it hurts you." Well, if that's true, that is, if putting sanctions in place harms the sanctioning country more than the target, then sanctions are unlikely to be as successful. Take, for example, the U.S. and Nigeria. In the 1990s, it was widely known that environmental and political activists were imprisoned and executed in Nigeria. In spite of the human rights abuses, and in spite of the fact that other countries had been punished for less, the United States, among others, was reluctant to impose sanctions. Why? Well, Nigeria has some of the highest quality crude petroleum available anywhere. Grades of petroleum can vary from region to region, with better grades requiring less refining, reducing costs, or resulting in less pollution. If the U.S. tries to punish Nigeria in order to force it to cease its human rights violations, many other countries would be happy to take their place and buy the Nigerian oil. In the end, Nigeria suffers no damage, but the U.S. has to shop elsewhere and would end up with an inferior product. Number 4, sanctions are more likely to succeed when the target's government is responsive to the needs of the citizens. When will the government be most concerned about the needs of its citizens? Probably in a democracy where citizens have the power to change the government on a regular basis. When will the government be least concerned about the needs of its citizens? In a dictatorship, the people have no power, and in fact, the suffering of the people can often be used to the advantage of the dictator, who can then pin the blame for said suffering on the foreign country. What can we conclude about economic sanctions? Sanctions are trade restrictions intended to punish a target country until it alters its behavior. The end goal of the sanctions, that is, actually changing the behavior, is most likely to be achieved if 1. The goal is small, 2. Other countries join in sanctioning the target, for example with a United Nations sanction, 3. The sanctions are more damaging to the target than they are to the sanctioner, and 4. The target's government is responsive to the needs of its citizens. Next time, who knows? I get ideas from viewers all the time, so let me know.